Well, the holidays are fast approaching, and if you're lucky enough to be baking for family this holiday season, then you might be seeking the help of one of the most famous cooks in America, Betty Crocker. For over 100 years, Betty Crocker and her products have been making cooking and baking easier, and her name has adorned everything from famous cookbooks to au gratin potatoes to fruit roll-ups. But despite her name recognition, you might be surprised to find out that Betty Crocker isn't, and never was, a real person. But despite being fictional, she has built an enduring legacy in cake. It is history that deserves to be remembered. In 1877, John Crosby joined Caldwaller Washburn's Milling Company to form the Washburn-Crosby Milling Company in Minneapolis, Minnesota. In 1880, they launched one of their most popular products, gold medal flour. In 1921, the company ran an ad for gold medal flour on the back cover of the popular magazine, the Saturday Evening Post. The ad was a jumbled puzzle of a street scene, and readers were meant to cut the cover up and arrange the scene. Once complete, the puzzle could be sent into the company for a prize, a pincushion shaped like a miniature bag of flour. The campaign was a massive success, and the company received tens of thousands of completed puzzles. However, the puzzles weren't the only things to come in the mail. Bakers wrote letters asking for advice about problems they were having. Questions like, how do I make a good chocolate chip cookie, or why is my cake so crumbly? Before the contest, these types of questions would be answered by members of the advertising department, often using the assistance of women within the company. Cookbooks, especially as we know them today with step-by-step instructions, weren't common, and it was often difficult for bakers to figure out what was going on with their recipes. Pan sizes were not yet standardized, and ovens often cooked unevenly. The company realized they had an opportunity to form a relationship with buyers of gold medal flour, but decided that advice would sound better if it came from a woman, and not from the all-male advertising department. The name Betty was chosen because it had a friendly and American characters, one of the most popular names in America at the time, and Crocker was taken from the name of a recently retired executive. The letters were typewritten, but the advertising department wanted to add a personal touch by adding a signature, and so the women in the company were encouraged to create a signature for the fictional character, and the signature eventually created by Florence Lindbergh, the secretary, was the one that was chosen for its simplicity and character. It quickly became policy to sign all letters to the public, Betty Crocker. Soon after, she began her career as a radio star. In 1924, the Washburn-Crosby Company purchased a failing radio station in Minneapolis and changed the call sign to WCCO to match the company initials. They began their gold medal flour home service talks that year, which soon became the Betty Crocker Cooking School of the Air. An employee, Blanche Ingersoll, was the first voice of Betty Crocker in the Minneapolis market, which soon spread to other stations with other voice actors. The same year brought a new employee to Washburn-Crosby, Marjorie Husted. Husted first worked at gold medal cooking schools around the country before returning to Minneapolis to organize the Home Service Department. The Home Service Department would grow to more than 40 women under Husted. At first, their primary job was to answer homemaking questions from the public, but Husted had much greater ambitions for the living trademark. Husted turned Crocker into an icon, expanding her role beyond answering questions and hosting radio shows. Husted took over almost everything involving Betty, including writing the scripts for the radio show and, in Minneapolis, providing her voice. Listeners could graduate from the radio program by completing reports that were mailed in to be graded by the Home Service Department. And of course, Betty Crocker herself. Her department also tested recipes and advertised the excellence of the company's flour. In 1928, Washburn-Crosby merged with several other mills to become General Mills, but Husted remained in charge of what was quickly becoming a national sensation. Husted interviewed eligible bachelors and stars like Joan Crawford and Cary Grant to learn about their home lives on the radio show. She also used what she learned from her time at the gold medal flour schools. Noticing that women would tap down the cup when measuring flour and sugar, she made sure to consider that when making Betty Crocker recipes. She created an enormous volume of content in the form of drama pieces, quizzes, and games. In 1929, General Mills introduced Betty Crocker coupons, box tops, that could be redeemed for discounts on houseware products in the Betty Crocker catalog. The coupons had a nominal cash value of half a cent, and with approval of the company, were even redeemed for items like dialysis machines. In 1936, Betty Crocker's radio voice was standardized with the advent of recording equipment. Husted's work was sensitive to women, turning the character into a figure of dignity who treated homemakers with respect. General Mills commissioned her first portrait, created by combining several of the women's features, in 1936. During the Second World War, Betty Crocker did her share, hosting a radio show called Our Nation's Rations at the request of the War Information Office that gave advice to people on how to extend their rations. Some 7 million copies of a pamphlet called Our Share were produced that gave recipes and advice and information on how to build a victory garden. During the war, Betty Crocker was recognized by some 90% of homemakers, and a 1945 survey found her to be the second most recognizable woman in America, right behind Eleanor Roosevelt. That same year, Fortune magazine outed her as a fictional character, called her a fraud, but it didn't seem to impact her popularity one bit. They proudly announced on the radio show that she was America's First Lady of Food. In the late 1940s, Betty Crocker received thousands of letters, including famously 4 or 5 marriage proposals a week. In 1944, Husted began the Betty Crocker Home Legion, which enlisted 70,000 women to encourage homemaking as a career. Good housekeeping is an art, and it's about time it is treated as such, Husted said. She was named Woman of the Year by the Women's National Press Club in 1948, an award that was presented by President Truman. It was the first time a businesswoman was so honored. Her name is now mostly known as a brand of boxed meals, from cake mixes to au gratin potatoes, but her name wasn't put on food until 1942, when it was first applied to soup mixes. Her first cake mix for a ginger cake was released after the war. Husted eventually became a high-ranking executive, although she was paid only a quarter of her male colleagues, despite her successful work for the company. She became a spokesperson against sexism in business, and in 1951 said, "Management is dominated by men, and there is no indication of interest on the part of the employers for change." She left to begin her own company in 1950. In the same year, the company released the Betty Crocker Picture Cookbook, with over 2,100 recipes developed at Betty Crocker Test Kitchens. The cookbook featured step-by-step instructions and helped to launch a deluge of competitor cookbooks. General Mills advertised that over $100,000 was spent in testing and developing recipes before a single page was printed. The cookbook became a bestseller, and it and subsequent editions have since sold over 75 million copies. In the 1950s, Crocker reached perhaps her greatest fame and influence as a cook, releasing recipe cards that reflect the period, although today they often come across as dated, such as ham loaf, tuna and jello pie, and hot dog fondue. Janet Kelly, who took over for Husted, invented what ads proclaimed was the first really new cake in 100 years, the chiffon cake. Starting in 1949, Adelaide Holly Cumming was hired to portray Crocker on television. She played Crocker in the Betty Crocker Show and the Betty Crocker Star Matinee. Cumming also played Crocker in commercials and as an advertising character on television shows. In one episode of the Gracie Allen and George Burns show, George introduces her by saying, "I don't know how to bake a cake, Gracie, but here's Betty Crocker to show us how." In 1954, General Mills added the red spoon logo that now adorns all Betty Crocker branded products, her seal of approval. Up until 1985, tourists could visit the Betty Crocker Test Kitchens in Minneapolis and then nearby Golden Valley, Minnesota. And reportedly, sometimes the tour guides had to console visitors who were distraught when they found out that Betty Crocker wasn't real. She was the epitome of the 1950s homemaker, and ads at the time gave advice for things like how to get your husband excited about dinner, or how to kiss and make up by making a splendiferous cake that says, "I'm sorry." A popular myth says that General Mills and other companies decided in the 1950s to have bakers add fresh eggs to their cake mixes because sales of instant mixes were abysmal. The myth says that eggs weren't necessary, but they made bakers feel less guilty about taking the easy way out. But sales of cake mixes didn't struggle at first. The grain of truth to this myth is that a man named Ernest Ditcher did do a study for General Mills examining why cake mix sales had leveled off in the mid-50s. And Ditcher came up with the idea that companies should give housewives something to do so that they felt like they were part of the process, like add fresh eggs. In reality, even within the companies, there have been heated arguments over whether they should include dried eggs in the mixes. A Pillsbury CEO called it the hottest controversy we had over the product. How influential the study was, however, is questionable. Turns out that fresh eggs are just better ingredients, and food historian Laura Shapiro says that if adding eggs persuaded some women to overcome their aversion to cake mixes, it was at least partly because fresh eggs made for better cakes. Despite that, sales of Pillsbury mixes, which included dried eggs, were successful at the same time as the Betty Crocker mixes, which didn't. Ads did argue, however, that making the cake itself was only part of the process, and that homemakers were still doing the hard part, which probably did help sales. In 1953, Better Home and Gardens magazine assured readers that you can put your effort into glorifying your cake with frosting, dreaming up an exciting trim that puts your own label on it. While Betty Crocker was becoming a household name, the advent of television and the growing market of easy-to-make boxed foods began to push the women out of the advertisements. Shapiro says that by the late 50s and early 60s, Crocker disappeared entirely from commercials. You see a spoon dancing around a little bowl instead. Cumming was let go in 1964 as the company decided on a new direction for the brand. Official portraits continued to be updated over the years, even as the Crocker presence as a person faded. In 1996, General Mills held a contest asking for photos and an essay about Betty Crocker. 75 winners were chosen and used as inspiration for the new portrait. When trying to assess Crocker's legacy, one thing that stands out are the number of other fictional marketing cooks and bakers who have now been forgotten. Fruit Company Dole had Patricia Collier, Pillsbury had Ann Pillsbury, and Quaker Oats had Mary Alden. But none of them had the staying power of the Lady in Red. The character of Betty Crocker evolved over time, depending on who was directing her and the needs at the time. During the Depression and the war years, Betty Crocker was a calm voice that helped housewives to figure out how to stretch their limited resources. In the 1950s, her name and voice peppered the airwaves, offering suggestions and solutions to homemakers for their everyday problems. But as women moved outside the home, the idea of a homemaker providing advice to homemakers slowly faded. And with it faded the idea that cooking is an art that should be passed on from mother to daughter, for good or for ill. But despite that character fading, Betty Crocker perhaps spends more time in our kitchens today than she ever did in the 1950s. On all sorts of products, she's a worldwide image now, including a popular presence in the Middle East. In 1999, Advertising Age listed Betty Crocker as the fourth most recognized advertising icon of the 20th century, behind the Green Giant, Ronald McDonald, and the Marlboro Man. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.